Pleasant greetings to all. I was appointed chairman of the Constitutional Review Commission in 2022 and had the pleasure to work with fellow commissioners up until the launch of our report at the end of November 2023. Since then, we have made certain observations that have encouraged me to promote our report in different ways, as we all remain keen to see accurate coverage of the report. The Commission undertook a total of 45 educational and consultative engagements, attracting over 1,000 attendees in person and over 1,900 views on social media. The CRC received 464 individual submissions, both in writing and orally, but the number of individual comments submitted is estimated to be closer to 1,000, as each submission would of course contain more than one comment. These were all collected and arranged by themes, and these sentiments and expressions from the general public are what form the basis of our report. The report is therefore quite an extensive document, but in an effort to address the repeated requests from the public during our public consultations for greater educational opportunities, we took the decision to retain a fair bit of our research in the body of our report. Many of you have told me that you have found this helpful. Persons who have not yet been able to are encouraged to read the body of the report itself, rather than reading the recommendations in isolation. We welcome your endorsement of aspects of the report with which you agree, but we also encourage healthy discussion where you do not agree. We have therefore invited an independent panel to share their views with you. Dr. Angel Smith is one of our historians and a former director of Virgin Islands Studies at the H. Laverty Stout Community College. He is also a past member of the Virgin Islands Legislature. Ms. Shaina Archer is an engineer and a past chairman of the former BVI Chamber of Commerce and Hotel Association. Ms. Smith Archer offers commentary on social and political issues affecting the Virgin Islands. Mr. Daniel Davies is a lawyer in practice, private practice, who also offers social commentary from time to time. Mr. Coy Levens hails from our sister island of Anegada, and he is a pilot and former managing director of the BVI Airports Authority and is currently the director of civil aviation in the government of the Virgin Islands. We invite you to listen in. We of course would like to thank our panelists for their time, and I am grateful and thankful to GIS and the government of the Virgin Islands for making this possible. Thank you.
Good day, and welcome to a conversation about the recent release of the report from the Constitutional Review Commission. My name is Shaina Smith Archer. With me today, I have a few gentlemen that are going to help us unpack what this report means for us as a territory going forward. I will be assisted with moderation by Dr. Angel Smith. Dr. Smith, welcome.
Thank you. Well, today we look at the whole concept of constitutional review. We just had a constitutional review. And it's important for us to understand from BVI context that the modern system that we have, that first constitution came in 1949, 1950, and was in fact modeled off the constitution for Montserrat. And we had local persons who sat as a constitutional review team that hammered into it and then came up with what was good for us, where we had a full at large system because there were no districts. And then from there, we went into a membership system. Then in 1965, we had another constitutional review that ushered in the ministerial system. Other changes along the way, and the last major one then would have been with the at-large voting system. And all of these are things that are coming out in this review, because constitutions are reviewed ideally every 10 years or so. You review your constitution because you would have changed, you would have grown. So you need now to adjust to different things. And then we had our last major constitution review. It would have been about 2007. And so now I think we've been long overdue.
Yes.
For a constitutional review. So this one is welcomed and quite a heavy bit of information.
It is. So with us today to help us also unpack all of this is Mr. Corey Levens and Mr. Daniel Davies, Esquire. And guys, we're going to jump right in, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Constitutional Review Commission was given quite a listing of terms of reference, and there were quite a bit of questions, and some are more sensational than others, I would say. So we are going to basically try to put this in a nutshell in the time that we have been given, but it is something that we want to ensure that persons get an understanding of what it is the report contains, the recommendations, and what it is they are presenting for us in terms of options and the way forward. So we'll start off with the first term of reference, which spoke to how does executive ministerial government can be held accountable or there be more transparency. And there were quite a bit of items in that report. So I'll start off first with you, Daniel. One of the recommendations, one of the first sets I would say would be around transparency, accountability, and the importance of public consultation. And specifically, the report mentioned that where possible, hearings and meetings should be held in public. Committee meetings of the House of Assembly should also be held in public. And the annual reporting of departments, this is something that persons should actually deliver on these things. What are your thoughts around those recommendations or anything else that you might want to add to that?
I think that the overall, I'll just address the entire report as a whole before I get to my specific comments. There's certainly a degree of sagaciousness with respect to the report. It does not give hard line for the most part. We do not accept this. We do not accept that. It leaves it up to debate, which is something that is extremely critical. It is not saying that this is what we recommend because we are the say all and be all. It does give the flexibility required for debate. So, for example, it would say when it comes to the direct election of ministers, well, if you wish to pursue this way, if the models that we have produced does not meet the requirements of the community, of the country, then an in-depth study will be needed in order to see what can be done. Now, with respect to the recommendations surrounding holding the executive to account, I quite agree with the report. And in particular, it is important that certain committee meetings are actually held in public. And so that is something that is necessary because the public has a right to know what is going on. They have a right to know what representations are being made on their behalf within the House of Assembly, because that is the people's house. It is where people from all walks of life in the Virgin Islands are represented. And so things like the Public Accounts Committee, that needs to be held in public. When people go and when they go into committee stage for legislation, for the most part, that should be held in public, except for where it's dealing with national security issues and so on and so forth. Those are my comments with respect to that.
Okay, I think one of the first things I want to say is that the comments that is reflected in the Constitution is not really the comments in terms of the expression of the commissioners, but more so it is the expression of the people. So one of the things you'll see through and through the Constitution is you would see that there are recommendations that are being made. Some recommendations that are being made are recommendations that are directly from the individuals that would have liked to express their sentiments. In terms of the executive being held accountable, I think the environment in which we are operating is critical. And public consultation is something that we need to take keen interest in, because public consultation is the actual bedrock of transparency, the ability for individuals to have the knowledge to question what it is that governments are doing and to be able to ensure that there are checks and balances in place to represent them. So I'm one of those, like Daniel. I agree with the recommendation put forward by the commissioners.
But at the same time, consultation without knowledge and information is a wasted exercise, because then you can predetermine the outcome by giving specific information. So I think what I found throughout, similarly as Daniel noted in terms of the commissioners, they talk about the whole process of education. Where you look at, there is a bill coming up to the House. There is a new policy. There should be some discussion. There should be some education in terms of what it is before you say, well, all right, we just need public consultation on the matter, but then we have to go through the process, which is noted that we go through the process of education, because that is the key to it. Because if we don't have an educated populace, then they can't give the information that is needed, that they have looked at the information, they have looked at, because they know what they're talking about. So they're just pulling things out of the hat and saying, well, this is what I think. But, they're saying that based on the information that is presented, this is how I conclude. So I think that the commissioners did a very good job in that, pointing out that education is the key throughout.
Yeah.
Well, education is key for a lot of things. And one of the good things that the commission did, that I think when you're applying the technical aspects of educating the public on a bill, is that the commission had meetings outside of work hours, right? Outside of the ordinary working hours. So rather than having the public consultations and meetings on bills and legislation, which often occur, in working hours or just after 5:30, when everybody's trying to rush to go home and get changed or whatever, and ray, as you may say, the commission did an excellent job in ensuring that they had meetings at times when people can actually get to the meetings, and that is an incredibly important part of public education. And they also started many of the meetings with a brief outline of what their job is, what a constitutional review is, and also outlining certain things with respect to self-determination and the role that a constitution could play within that framework. And so that was really something very critical, and it's something that I believe that the ministers and policymakers within the government can really take some notes from.
Yeah, and I think even, going forward, guys, on a more consistent basis, because, sometimes we think public consultation is just about a meeting, when, again, there needs to be preliminary information that's shared and enough time is given for persons to digest it. So in the case of when bills go to the House, it is something where, while we have to wait on the first reading before it's made public, sometimes, the agenda turns it right or wrong. So there's really no time. So I think that's definitely one of the points that they're highlighting here that is of importance, that going forward, as far as governance is concerned, particularly around how do we hold our executive, because cabinet, we know, is basically behind closed doors. So our only opportunity as the public is through the House of Assembly, which is the legislative branch. And if there are still aspects of that happens behind closed doors, we're still being left out, so to speak, on the street. So,
well, I think this is where we get to the discussion of transparency. Education first have to start with having the information being presented to the people, so the people could educate themselves. So we have to look at things like the Freedom of Information Act, and we have to ensure that individuals have the information provided for them, so that they of themselves could educate themselves from that perspective. So I think it's key that the government need to look, and I think this was mentioned also as part of the recommendation of the commissioners, to see if we can get the ball moving with getting that information act. Because at the end of the day, right, how do you scrutinize or even provide education to people on the public forum via discussion and debates if the information is not made available to you? So from that perspective, I think transparency is key, and I think that one of the recommendations that I like that the commission made is the recommendation for the implementation
The freedom of information.
of the freedom of information. Like, that's very important to the people of this territory because it's a democracy and individuals need to know what decisions are being made on their behalf.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's key. So that's recommendation number 5 for those that might want to go and check these out in the summary report. Chapter 6 is a very comprehensive list of all of the recommendations that's made in the report. So I really also appreciate how things have been outlined to make it more reader friendly. In terms of capturing the substance, and then for the engineers like me, they go into the weeds in the 200 pages before. So let's jump into the system, guys, because I think you guys are touching on it, but we scored in. There were a lot of questions that were asked as it relates to what needs to change, what we probably should think about introducing, do we dress up what we have? Can it be improved? So questions around junior ministers, how effective is the position and the standing of it at large members, that also came up. The 2007 Constitution makes provision for 6 minister, but it is with the provision that we increase the number of members in the House of Assembly to 15, so from 13 to 15, and direct voting of the premier. So we're gonna take this little bucket and we're gonna start to deal with it in terms of, how do we need to maybe restructure or think about our structure? Because just to kind of remind us, the executive branch of government based in the Westminster system is inside of the legislative branch. So you can't really hold it separately accountable compared to what we see maybe in the US, where the president and his cabinet, which is appointed, is separate and apart from the house or their Congress. And then there's a judicial branch. So there are 3 branches of government. That's Civics 101. So this is a question that we are facing right now in terms of, based on the current system that we have, can we achieve true accountability in the sense that we know of, or do we move to something else? For example, another one of the recommendations was around bicameralism, which is something history tells us did exist back in the 1700s when the first parliament was actually constituted. And but we went to just what's called unicameral, or just the one house. So let's start with the junior ministers and the at-large. What are your thoughts there as it relates to those?
Well, for me, junior ministers kind of is a shady area for me. It's very hard sometimes to see the distinction between the junior minister and the backbencher, one. And number 2, I would deduce that if you're implementing a junior minister, then it means, well, I interpret it as there is some sort of workload on the existing portfolios, which means to say that we may need to look at a 6th minister to be able to shed some of the work. So the reality is, I think the system, we need to look at the system, but I think what's key is we need to focus on the root causes of our issues to ensure that whatever changes we make, that it actually change an issue that we're experiencing and not just change the system for changing the system. So where junior ministers are concerned, for me, it's kind of a gray area for me, because the backbenchers there, the junior ministers there, and they really don't have any teeth. So the reality is, if they are being put in place to shed some of the workload, should we not look at maybe the implementation of a 6th minister?
Well, I think it's interesting because when we went into the system in the 1990s, once the at-large system was in place, and then we recognized that the BVI was growing. The administrative system was becoming more burdensome. The first point was not a junior minister, but a parliamentary secretary. because I served in that role as a parliamentary secretary. And all it was more work for me because now I had to go into the office every day, and I work as a parliamentary secretary in the Ministry
To
of
the
Health and
ministry.
Education. So that was inside.
And this was as a representative,
This
right?
was as a representative, but I was assigned a role as a parliamentary secretary.
Which happens throughout the region.
Exactly,
I've heard
and
about
it's the same thing with the Westminster style system of government, where you can have parliamentary secretaries, where you give persons additional responsibility, and in fact, what it is a sort of a training ground for your future ministers. And then I think because that need has grown, we've reached a point where we say, all right, well, we have junior ministers. So you can see the progression that we've been going through. But the reality, as you come back to what Coy was saying, is that what is recognized is that we have created far more ministries than there are ministers. So one minister has up to 4, 5 different
4, 5,
ministries,
yeah.
and each ministry has a permanent secretary. And I wonder, well, this is strange. So I know that I worked in education, for example, and the minister had the permanent secretary. And then, in fact, then you had your chief education officer, you had a chief librarian. And we have to struggle to get the minister's attention as heads of departments to be able to get decisions on certain things. So I wonder, well, when you now have about 3 or 4 permanent secretaries vying for the attention of the minister, how would that work?
Yeah.
So in essence, what we're seeing is that there is a need in terms of manpower on the ground, in terms of ministries and ministers, because then you need to have persons who then shepherd the policy making and implementation aspects of the government.
Yeah.
So if we look at the addition of an additional minister, it means then automatically you wouldn't necessarily need
The junior ministers. Yeah.
Maybe you might need a parliamentary secretary here
Yeah.
and there, because that doesn't really change anything, because you're not a part of the executive. And as a parliamentary secretary, you still remain as a backbench and free to speak as a backbench, a backbench person. So that whole thing, but I thought I should touch on the whole concept of at large, because that is, I don't know, it's an issue that we have not seemed to handle very well.
But before you get
You
there,
know?
could we talk? I want to
You
get
wanna
away
weigh
from
in?
the junior minister
Okay,
part of it.
yeah.
Okay.
One has to consider when one talks about ministers and junior ministers, where do they derive their power, right? Or their abilities to discretions and so on and so forth, right? And it is through legislation. So the Constitution does not define even now what the responsibilities of various ministers are, and that is because ministries may change. You may wish the premier and may wish to, or the winning party of the ruling party, I should say, or the party with the majority. That nomenclature right there. The party with the majority may decide that, okay, they want to organize the ministries in a different way, and so it's not necessary it would be unwise, therefore, to put the responsibilities of various ministers within the Constitution. So how do ministers derive their powers, and how would junior ministers derive their powers? Because one of the complaints that was raised, and you can see it in the report, is that junior ministers have no teeth, as you say. Junior ministers don't have much power. But I think that the complaint arises out of a misunderstanding of how that arises. And so various bits of legislation give ministers the power to do X, Y, and Z. For example, the Minister of Health can, upon the advice of upon consulting with the National Drug Advisory Council, may add items to the list of scheduled drugs underneath the Drugs Prevention and Misuse Act, or they may take it away. Under the Business, Trades and Professions Act, I believe it's called, the minister has the power to grant trade licenses. And so if you want junior ministers to have a bit more power, then you need to amend that legislation to say that junior ministers have the power to do X, Y, and Z within a certain portfolio, you know? Not within a certain portfolio, within a certain within parameters of a certain statute. So that is how junior ministers and ministers have the power. Because if you didn't have these statutes and you didn't have statutes saying what the powers of the ministers were, then the ministers would be in the same position as the junior ministers, apart from they were sitting cabinet.
So the point then that Dr. Smith just raised, then you support it by saying that it was more of a parliamentary secretary role, where the minister receives administrative support of some sort from a policy standpoint, but they're not necessarily able to act as a minister, because I think that's probably the problem with the naming, where a person's here junior minister and we're thinking they're able to have the capacity of a junior minister, but based on what you just said, Daniel, that's not the case.
Well, the other difficulty is, the difficulties is within the legislation, but within the constitution, a junior minister cannot defer, or cannot speak on their own, as it were, because they're bound by collective responsibility pursuant to the constitution, right? Meaning to say that they're not necessarily free to criticize government and government policies as a result of that. So they don't have the power to do anything, but they're bound by the same...
that they're a minister.
As if they were actually a full cabinet minister. They can't become a junior... they can't become a deputy speaker. They can't fulfill other...
so I definitely support then a sixth minister.
Yeah,
So
and that's what
it boils down to.
And that's what the report is saying.
Yeah.
They're recommending
Sixth minister, and move away from the junior minister.
But the point that is important for me is that we kind of need to understudy what the various portfolios are, because the reality is, if a junior minister carries no teeth, then one could deduce that the best option for us out is to kind of look for a sixth minister. A sixth ministry. But I think what's key for me is that we need to be able to align the portfolios so that we, the people, can be represented properly, and that there's no overloading of ministers and various portfolios.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think we in essence, because we look at the recommendation in the report, recommendation number 15, specifically say, well, increase
it.
one minister,
Because,
six ministers.
again,
and bearing in mind all the discussions that we've just had, which is the information that is there.
Yeah. Yep. So I think that's one of the things, because, again, the name minister also, I think, has been misleading over the years. So with that in mind, and again, what is the objective? We're trying to achieve better levels of transparency and accountability. So if a sixth ministry come in and we look at maybe the parliamentary secretaries, that's something that could give the support to the ministers that they need, but achieve it a different way.
But that's another assumption that about something that will come later down in the discussion.
That's okay.
With respect to direct elections of either ministers and premiers /
Well, we're going to get into it now that we're going to the at-large.
But all of that, but the discussion on junior ministers is predicated on
what happens
us not
there.
Moving, whether or not we shift systems.
So let's go there.
Yeah.
So Dr. Smith.
Because I was saying the whole concept of at large for us, right? And this is where we have something, we add something to it, but then we didn't show what we add. And then we
haven't assessed
ourselves.
it yet.
We have confused ourselves.
Yeah.
And I'll say this. In the Virgin Islands, there was a concept of at large long before we have the official term of at large. From the very beginning, it was always used because you had political parties. So you said someone was running for with a political party in the district, but this other person is running at large. Meant that he has no party affiliation.
So it was an independent candidate?
Independent, because they didn't say they were independent candidates. They said they ran at large. And I remember that growing up in the village, because you had persons who came into the second district and they said that the person was running at large. They were not with the Democratic Party or they were not with the Virgin Islands Party.
But still within the district.
No, they were running in the district.
But they were
an independent candidate, but that was not the term that was used. The term that was used was at large. Hence, I feel when we brought in the at large seats, persons still have in their mind the traditional concept of what it means to be at large. You are not aligned with a political party. Hence our first problem.
Yeah, and I think that is when we go back to, again, asking ourselves, what was the intent of
Yeah.
doing that in the first place? Because we had 9 districts, so there were 9 members of the House plus attorney generals and speaker. And we essentially know there was an amendment.
Yes.
And we did some homework and read in terms of an initial review of the system in terms of what it was supposed to be. But because those at-large members now, or representatives, were not truly independent candidates, that the level of party politics still plays a big role in using the change in the system to their advantage rather than allowing for an independent voice, I think, to come into the system. That's my understanding of what this was supposed to do
And I don't
versus what happened.
I don't think you're far, because the reality is that the views of the underground in the day was that, listen, this was introduced sort of high-handedly. And the political leaders of the day felt, well, listen, this is an attack on us because the party politics was entrenched in the districts. And there were some districts across the Virgin Islands that were considered specific party districts. Nobody could win in that district unless you were in a particular party. And it was felt, but how do you break that stranglehold that the parties had on districts? How do you now advance the system? So the decision was, all right, we throw in the at-large vote because now the parties have the district, but you bring in these persons who can run across the territory, bring in a whole new field of candidates. But then what happened, as in every case, and I figured that this is what it means to be a Virgin Islander, you look at what you see as an obstacle, and you find a way.
It's called political strategy. Doc.
Yeah, so the parties then use and say, all right, but if we have a stronghold in the district, that means all people in the district are vote for who we said to vote for.
Yes, all the way.
And hence the term all the way. Yes. And that was a whole new term that came in with the at-large system. So parties are saying, we vote in party all the way. And then persons are going to say, listen, I don't care who he is. Just tell me which one for the party.
Yeah.
And that's all they voted for.
Because if there was a restriction around it, then I could see maybe it would have done what the hope was there. Daniel, what's your thoughts?
So the situation is this. We take a look at the report with respect to why and how the at-large system was introduced. And they were supposedly supposed to be independent candidates, but that would have meant that you would have always had a minority government or a coalition government, because you're increasing the House from 9 to 13. Therefore, the uptick, you require at least seven
For majority.
7 for majority. So if the 4 was supposed to be independent, then how on earth would you get a majority unless you won 7 of the districts?
Which was possible.
So, but it's not likely.
No,
It's just not. I don't know if there was a. It might have. It's possible.
Yeah, it was.
But
yeah.
it's I'm not quite sure if therefore the sentiments behind the introduction of 4 independent who were supposed to be independent, but 4 at large who were supposed to be independent was really grounded in any sort of common sense, if that is the case.
It was a theory.
It was a theory.
It was a walking
theory. But
theory.
you see, it wasn't that it was said, because it was introduced and there were no distinctions given.
No.
There was no guidelines. There was nothing. That's the issue.
Yep.
So it was open, just like we say now. It was open to interpretation, and it was interpreted that the parties say, okay, this is a good thing. We can use it.
Yeah.
So, and I assume that is what the Constitution would do. It gives you something, and you work it how best it suits you.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't make an excuse by saying it was a theory, because there are many things out there that are said to be theories, which are absolute nonsense. You wouldn't pay it any mind. You wouldn't pay it any mind if it when it came across you.
Yeah, but
So
I want to pose another question to you though, because what you're saying again, something was introduced, and it's only through experience. It's either going to be proven or disproven. So we're at a place now.
Yeah.
So Koi, one of the part of the recommendation here. This is recommendation 11: direct election of the premier and revision of that large system. Okay, in the report now, they are speaking directly to whether or not the premier and deputy premier should be selected from those offices. So we have 4 members that are territorial, right? Let me use territorial to keep it clear.
Yeah.
So the territorial candidates versus a district candidate. And those persons will be selected through the deputy premier. So this is where it got interesting for me, because then in part of what they were explaining, they were saying, subject to an electoral boundaries commission, so we would have to look again, and we're overdue for one probably. Again, keeping in the back of our mind about the 6th ministry, because as we said earlier, all of these things are connected because it's the same system. That we could either look at increasing the number of seats in the House of Assembly from 13 to 15, made up of 9 districts, 6 territorial, so there's an increase of 2, or increase the number of seats in the House of Assembly from 13 to 15, all territorial. So what came to mind, 2 things came to mind. The additional seats, if they were to be, I would add them actually on as districts, because the conversation that hasn't entered in, and I think it may be in here someplace, was about representation for the sister islands. So Just Van Dyke, Virgin Gorda, and Antigua, in terms of them having representation, in terms of this being an opportunity, I would say. And if we were to change it to an all-territorial house, would it be then that we're looking at basically the 2 persons that got the highest votes become the premier and the deputy premier, and it is for them to form a government?
Well, I mean, in terms of the district council for Antigua, I think what we have to do is...
Well, not a district council, as
But a
a
minister.
representative.
A representative,
but I'm coming to the district council because that is what the commission recommended. In terms of district council versus at-large candidates, my first question to you would be, does an at-large candidate brings more to the House than a district? I know it's kind of a debatable kind of question, but the question is, if you have an at-large candidate, you have someone that is representative of the masses of people, which is the exact road to true democracy, individuals having the right to make their selection. But I think that I'm in agreement that we should increase the House from the 13 to the 15, but I think that the easiest strategy to get that done is through the at-large. So
you go out territorial.
So, well, I wouldn't say I wouldn't go at-large territorial, because I think the hybrid system has proven that it works. People would like to be represented from the district level, but individuals also would like to be represented from the at-large, and I think the at-large provides more scope and in my humble opinion, prohibits a lot of nepotism that can possibly happen in the district, because the whole purpose of our constitutional reform is to ensure that whatever institutions we have in place, that there are checks and balances, that at the end of it all, the people is who come out on the other end of the stick, or for want of a better word, on the positive end of the spectrum. As it goes now to Antigua, I think what we need to do is look at what the root cause of the problem is. Is the root cause lack thereof of representation? Because a district council can provide the same level of representation that a minister would provide. We currently have representation, but we're still in the same scenario that we're in. So I think we kind of have to look at what the true issues are and adjust or adapt our constitution to kind of give us the output that we want as a territory, and not just make changes for the sake of making changes.
Well, I like to look back, right? And I would say that...
That's your job, right?
Yeah, I'm a historian.
Yeah.
I live in the past. I always say I live in the land of the dead and enjoy every bit of it, because they just come
They don't
there.
harass you.
Yeah, okay? But the reality is that the very first government that was given, constitutional government given to the Virgin Islands in 1773, I think it was, right? And then with a bicameral system. with a House of Assembly and what was referred to as a Privy Council. Now, in that, the membership, I think, might have started about 13 somewhere there.
15.
But the 15, yes, the membership included, I remember going through some stuff where they had election on Jos van Dyke. And who won that seat in Jos van Dyke. This was a planter class, you know. Their numbers were nothing close to what we have now.
Correct.
In Virgin Gorda, there was a representative for North Sound
Two of them.
and also for the Valley.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm saying, well, what is it they knew that we don't seem to understand?
Good question.
The joke was, when they had the election in Jos van Dyke, I think it was only two persons voting anyway.
That is their democratic
But it was
right.
exactly,
Yes,
these
the
guys had a
democratic
right
right.
to be represented.
That's right.
And they went in and there was all this big fanfare. But it was two persons came to vote.
Yeah.
But the reality is that they were represented in the House of Assembly. So I think we now struggle because we think about numbers. And it does, when we think about numbers, and we like to refer to the presidential system and the US system where they talk about who can win the smallest numbers over there. That means they can carry the largest numbers over here. So you listen to hear what happens in Iowa. Because whoever wins Iowa is the one who is going to win the thing. But what I'm saying here is that with the at-large system, now we're talking the hybrid system that the commissioners of the commission report is presenting. One, we can look at increasing the number of at-large voters, at-large seats, keeping the districts as we have them, 9 districts, and then you increase the at-large seats. Or we can look at completely
All at large.
all at large. And when I saw that, I said, well, you know what? We are a strange bunch in the Virgin Islands. We usually go backwards. The very first legislative council was voted at large because there were no districts. We moved out of that because then the persons in the districts felt that they were being overlooked. Because the at-large representatives at the time came from what would have been referred to as the town elites, the businessmen. And but these are persons who were looking nationally about the development of the territory. But persons feel that they were not concerned about what happened in the little
Out West
corners
End
and
and
in the little areas. You know, so they pushed down for the district system, which had corrected that. But now we've reached a stage where we say, well, we want people who could talk about the national issues and the international issues. Do we run the same risk of getting to the point where we don't see the district issues anymore?
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, the difficulty that I have with, and this is going to be, I'm going to pick your brain a bit here, that I don't think in the commissioner's report was making a recommendation that you have to choose this or the other. It is for us to study what the best option is, right?
Yeah.
And some may say bicameralism is the way to go. So why not have the at-large members elected at large sit in a Senate, as it were, in a Senate capacity, and have the district district sit in the lower house or vice versa. I mean, you could do that and still also increase the amount of persons in the district. Because with respect to district seats, because I do think that the people of Anegada, this is from my experience campaigning, all around, sorry, not just Anegada, but all around the Virgin Islands, they would like developments in their communities to be discussed within the communities, and they want to make a decision as to how they would like to see their communities developed. And that was actually very strongly expressed in Anegada. It was not so much strongly expressed in Virgin Gorda, but certainly it was expressed in the first district, which is Western and Carrot Bay. That second district, that's my district. You live over there. And so what you could look at is actually a combination of the system to see what works for
That's a good.
best.
That's a different idea.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
one of those
yeah.
things that again.
But that's the idea.
Well,
That's the idea because I'll say this, right? If we are
And then we have to take a commercial
okay,
break.
if we are speaking about self-determination, to me the easiest strategy for self-determination is to look at a district council where the people within Anigada have direct power over the decision making. Because what the issue is sometimes is you may not have the individuals present that can actually make the representation. But I think what's key is if you could feed the information into a particular minister, what you're starting to do is you're starting to show self-determination being reflected in your sister islands before you transition it into
something more.
into something more.
Some of these things that, just as a recap, we've been talking a lot about the electoral system. So persons may think that, this is all about kind of like a politics thing, but it's all part of how are we able to achieve good governance? It's through a system, and the system can take a lot of different forms. So that's some of the things that, we want to encourage everyone again to download a copy of the report and to go through the recommendations. It's very user-friendly in terms of a lot of summaries are available in terms of the executive summary in the beginning of the document, as well as chapter 6 that has the entire list of the recommendations that have been made. So just to close off this last segment that we were touching on, where we spoke about junior ministers, increasing the size of the house, whether or not we want to have an additional house, the at-large system, or what is known as a territorial system, and how effective it is and how well it works, because I know a lot of points came out from our panel today in terms of what it would mean to make a change one way or the other. But one of the things that we definitely want to make sure that we walk away with is that we have to know that these changes all are going to have effects on each other. So we cannot say, let's take recommendation 2 and then run and not look at, what are the other aspects of the electoral system or the governance structure as it relates to executive branch, which is the cabinet, and the legislative branch, which is currently the House of Assembly, and how well they work together to give, a transparent system, one where they can hold each other accountable. Because apart from us, the public, holding our representatives, whether they're territorial or district, accountable, I think, we have enough evidence, I would say, guys, now that we know whether or not what we have is working well. And at least we have a direction now from the research of the commission to say where we can look at. So there's also recommendations around grounds to remove ministers, recall provision. All of these are things that are in there that is part of it. So in the interest of time now, we're going to change gears a bit and look around those recommendations that spoke to the question of independent institutions being effective. So, Dr. Smith.
Yeah, well, overall, I would say we look at governance. We've looked at the electoral system because we know that if a country is to function, we must have a proper electoral system. We must be able to elect government. And the thing that comes to mind is something that I remember in the last constitution. And I think it's still in the 2007 Constitution, in the 1976 amendments, where it states that there is a legislature, that the legislature of the Virgin Islands is comprised of, right now it says the House of Assembly and Her Majesty, right? The House of Assembly and Her Majesty. And it, in essence, it says that the role of the House of Assembly is to pass laws for the peace, order, and good governance of the Virgin Islands. And why I remember that, because when I was in the House, Conrad Maduro, who was always steeped in the Constitution, always said that the role of this legislative council is to pass laws for the peace, order, and good governance of the Virgin Islands. And he would not differ from that. That was, as a member, that's what your role is, first and foremost. The other things are secondary. But then we have to talk about the governance, because we recognize that, as you say, Civics 101, where you talk about the different sections. And I always say to person, listen, I taught primary school, class 2, social studies. We talked about the structure. And persons who say, oh, they don't know that, I say, well, you need to sit down and think. Because in class 2, that's where you learn about the legislative branch, the judiciary, and the executive. In class 2, very basic. and you move on from there. So now when we talk about good governance, we look now a little bit beyond the whole concept of how do we elect persons. Now we have elected persons, we have a legislative system where laws are made, but now how are we governed?
Yeah.
The good governance job. That's the next bit. And that's what we would touch on now. How do we look at what are the key areas that come out of this in terms of good governance? And Koi, you seem to be ready.
No, I take this one serious because I think two institutions that I think the report mentioned that we need to pay very special attention to is the Integrity Commission
Okay.
as one of them and the Contractor General. And if you really sit down and you assess it, you're operating in an environment where there's a lot of infrastructure development. So one would believe that that particular Contractor General Act should be in place to be able to ensure that the people of the territory get value for money in terms of the things that they're doing. And as it relates to the Integrity Commission, I think we need to start to look at holding our representatives to order, because I think one of the things that the report mentioned, it mentions that there should be a provision in the Constitution that allows information from the Integrity Commission to be able to have teeth, to be able to deal with individuals of misconduct. The way that we go about it, I guess, we'll have to look at it, but it's not difficult because you also have those provisions in the Constitution of Cayman Islands, I think, and Turks and Caicos. So I think those two institutions is key because the Integrity Commission established that Code of Conduct in Schedule 3. I don't know if we have, and I think the lawyers in the room would have to correct me, I don't know if we have a ministerial code of conduct in the British Virgin Islands, but is those two institutions that I think that we need to pay close attention to and that we need to structure, because those are the checks and balances that we have in place to ensure good governance of the individuals that represent us.
Yeah.
I take a different route. Firstly, we have to start from the top in these sort of discussions. The House of Assembly, as it currently is not necessarily a fully independent institution, as it were. And I think that is a point that didn't necessarily come out in the report, but upon reflection, it is something that I think is incredibly important, that it's stated in the Constitution that the House of Assembly is an independent body with some sort of legal personality, as it is in the United Kingdom. In terms of good governance, it's all about the system for me, as it is. It said that we are based on the Westminster model. I dispute that. Well, it's based on it, but resembles nothing of it. And quite frankly,
In terms of experience.
not just in terms of experience, both in the Westminster and the US presidential system, you have very healthy debates and not just inquiries as to whether or not certain pieces of legislation are working. You don't have that in this system. I mean, you might hear about it in some report or other from the Public Accounts Committee or Standing Finance Committee about resources that are needed or little amendments that are needed. But in the United States Congress, in the United Kingdom Parliament, and many other parliaments across the world, they actually have sessions where representatives question officials as to whether or not a certain piece of legislation is a problem, or if it's working, and they also question them as to whether they need to introduce legislation about a particular topic.
But should I interject here, Daniel? Because in essence, what we are saying from the report that we are dealing with, that they're recognizing that is a deficiency,
Yes.
and how we can correct that
develop
using the
that.
committee system within the House. So we know that we are we have a British parliamentary system, but we ain't get it quite right yet. But we're saying, the Commission is saying, the report is telling us, well, look, this is how we can fix that.
And I have no problem with that whatsoever.
Okay.
My only dispute is that we have a Westminster system. That was my
that look.
only. That was my
Well,
only.
But we're now trying to Westminsterize the
But let me,
system.
but let me put a
And
spin on
I
it.
think though that's a good point that he's raising though, that we should definitely I say highlight,
Yeah.
because it is something we hear the word thrown around, Westminster. But if you've never lived anywhere else or experienced any other political system, a lot of us don't know what that is supposed to be like, and the importance of having healthy public debates. And I know sometimes persons might tune into the British Parliament and think they're about to break down the place. But again, everybody goes out and has tea after.
Of course.
But it is something where you have enough room in your culture that I can have that big debates with you and say, I don't agree with this particular policy or this position. And from there, we still have to come together and make a decision on behalf of the nation to say this is where we need to go.
So the question becomes, do we have that level of debate in our...
Well, I think that's a cultural thing, that's something that you can just legislate or pick up or put a name on it and it's going to happen. It's like within any organization and as a country as a whole, this is something that we have to now start to develop and mature and build our skill set in.
Listen, I would say this is how in BVI we do everything. We have to now figure how we do it formally. For example, you go to church on Sunday. You can preach whatever you want, and people will shake their head, But when they go outside, they gather in corners,
and have
that's when they have a second service. We call it the meeting after the meeting. So what we're saying is, it isn't that we don't have the ability to do it, but we don't do it where it's supposed to be done.
Exactly.
We don't do the formal bit. So now we now need to, the education bit where we get persons now, well, how do you bring your input to the table to make a difference? Don't just sit down under the tree and voice all your opinions there and it's not recorded.
But the conduit have to exist for us.
Exactly.
And the systems in which we're referring to have to be functional.
Right.
Which goes back to human resource and finances being put in place to be able to sustain.
Exactly, and that's what the report is saying.
And that's what the report is
So I think, Daniel, what you're saying is that you're doing the work for the commission in terms of you're now summing up everything, because the commission is saying, listen, this is what we need. We have a Westminster system. Let us work it for what it's worth. And this is what we need to do in order to make it work.
Well, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that, as Mr. Levens was saying, is that you don't have appropriate resources for the House of Assembly to be able to do that sort of work. And the reason why, and we're going to juxtapose it against other institutions, other parliaments, is that, for example, in the US Congress, in the United Kingdom Parliament, in the Australian system, you have staffers who can assist the various different members and representatives in understanding various bits of policy, various bits of legislation. The staffers are able to assist the representative in highlighting certain aspects of what's going on in society and, well, in the constituency, and how this is affecting their constituents and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, we don't have that right now, and it's something that is critical. And in order to get our House of Assembly running so that we can ensure that good governance takes place. With respect now, moving on from that, to the Integrity Public Life Commission, one of the complaints that the governor had was that you had a code of ethics, a code of conduct, but you didn't have any provision whereby public officials that are caught violating or derogating from that code of conduct. You didn't have any provision where those persons could actually be punished. That was his complaint. So we have an Integrity and Public Life Commission. It's funded, or is about to be funded. There's space in the 2024 budget for it. And it's just that we have to find commissioners for that. But whether or not they will have teeth to enforce the code of conduct, that is another story.
Well, I think the discussion with the report that's the point that the report making.
Yes.
The report is saying that we need to be able to tie the Public Life Act to the Constitution from the perspective of ensuring that if you breach the Integrity Commission, that commissioner have the right to tell that politician that that individual vacate his seat, which puts us on now to things like the recall provision as another ways and means of mitigating against that.
Yeah.
That is a very interesting word to use, because I think in the federal United States system, you have the Ways and Means Committee, among other things. Generally speaking, all of these things could have been done within the House of Assembly. You know, you could have committees to determine these sort of stuff. But unfortunately, as was shown in the Commission of Inquiry, the committees which are tasked with enforcing various aspects of good governance within the House of Assembly just were not active. Were not functioning. And so we are now forced to have an independent commission do that work for us. And I agree with the commission that it does need to be tied with the Constitution, because you can't, by legislation, tell a member of the House of Assembly they must vacate their seat. That is a constitutional matter.
Correct. Correct.
So I do agree with the commission.
And that's also it was three institutions. It was the Integrity of Commission, Contractor General, and the Human Rights Commission.
Human Rights Commission.
That actually has been around since 2007 to be enacted. So hopefully, you know, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of standing up these institutions. I mean, persons may think it's just a matter of putting money in the budget, but there's a lot that has to be done in terms of actually having offices, people in them, procedures in place. So, but it is something that is absolutely necessary for us to be able to, again, have the levels of checks and balances, whether inside the legislative branch or outside, because, you know, because the executive sits in the legislative, for me, I don't have a problem with this being outside of the legislative until we remedy that problem. But one of the key things I want to just highlight that the report also spoke about was the importance of administrative and financial independence for those institutions that exist, such as the Office of Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General Chambers, because they're still tied to, I think it's the governor's group, you know, the administration, and in terms of independence outside of, again, the system that is there, it can be affected, I would say, by the executive branch. Because no, it's sitting underneath one of those things, and that's something that the recommendation that was given is that, you know, we need to improve the effectiveness of those current institutions that are there and make sure now that we don't do the same mistake with the ones that are.
But the elephant in the room is what about the governor? Because here it is, the governor is the most powerful official within the Virgin Islands. Yet we don't have any mechanism within the Virgin Islands of holding the governor to account. So it's all very well and good us talking about the House of Assembly and holding our local public officials to account, but what about the governor and even the deputy governor?
But I think we get carried away because when we speak about the governor, it's mentioned in the Constitution in terms of the role of the governor, right? The governor is the representative of Her Majesty, or His Majesty in this point, right? And they have their systems to hold the governor accountable, because now the governor is not representing us per se. That's why we have our legislative system. We have our representative. The governor now has his role, and his role is outlined. There are certain things we do. I think where it comes down to, in terms of, and this is where the report now talks about in terms of the powers of the governor. And what powers the governor has that can then be passed down. I think, and this is where the commissioners have actually touched on. So I don't know what your views are on that, because to me that is the key. Because we can't say
pick and choose what we want.
We can't just to derogate 1 second. But we look at the role of the governor.
One snide comment.
What happens now in terms of what? Let me put it this way.
Hold on, one snide comment.
Yeah.
The snide comment is the UK may very well have its system, but the governor isn't in the UK potentially causing confusion.
No. We can't say that. I don't agree with that.
But
I don't agree with
I want
that
to touch the point that Dr. Smith touched, and I think is something that I was looking at. There is a convention in the Scottish jurisdiction, the Sewell Convention. Y'all excuse me because I'm not a legal mind person. But the point is, that convention kind of speak to the powers being devolved to the local as to the local government. But also what it does is, to me, is like if you're going to make a decision, like I think we have an issue. I think there was a point that was raised by the individuals in the public meetings about the consolidated fund and money being moved out to the consolidated fund without prior. My thing is, if you have some sort of ethical clause that, okay, you can move your money, but at least let the leader of the country be aware that you're moving the money, because we all have budgets, we all have plans. So I think that model or a structure similar to that we could kind of look at, but keep in mind that a lot of these recommendations we're making, some of them just gradually move away from the Westminster style of government. So whether or not we'll be able to sell it is one thing, but I think that for flexibility purposes, I think we need to go down the road of that particular recommendation and kind of look to see if there is something that can be had that we can strike the balance.
All right, let me. I was going to say this, right? We did not have a governor in the Virgin Islands, right? The governor was in Antigua. After the West Indies Federation went defunct and all the other colonies then started going independent, then we had an administrator. So in the 1970s, we then felt like we were finally a colony and we were given a governor for the first time. D.G. Cudmore, the governor of the Virgin, first appointed governor of the Virgin Islands. And we were happy with that because we felt that we were on a level with everybody else. We have a governor. We don't have an administrator until the governor, in the prerogative of mercy, ruled against the committee because the governor had that was his responsibility. And we say, listen, Cudmore must go. We don't want him no more. What I'm saying is that, we want it when it suits us. And when it doesn't fit what we want, we don't want it no more.
And that's one of the things.
That's the problem.
That was one of the things, too, I was also going to raise the point. Because, again, also in this report, we talk about the need for further conversation about self-determination, right? And if we have this as our ultimate goal post. Our relationship, whether it's with the UK through the governor that is here locally, the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, is going to have to start to guide the decisions that we have. Because I don't find it's okay that you can go in and take up public taxpayer dollars. So, no convention's going to make me rest easy with that one. And again, it just keeps constantly reminding us what kind of model overall that we still have, we are not a sovereign state. And this is the behavior that we tend to want to have sometimes. We are not a sovereign state. So as a result of that is why in the constitutional order, there's a role for the governor, there's a role for elected government. And I don't know if it's in here because I haven't dug enough for it, but it is something that I'm going to raise again. The government, the executive authority of our country is vested in the governor and not in the cabinet.
No, it's vested in Her Majesty.
And which is represented by the governor.
Represented by the governor.
However, in other overseas territories, when I was doing research on this, I think Cayman and the Turks and Caicos, they negotiated basically in their orders that the executive authority is shared between the sovereign and the local government. Correct. So there are some nuances. Again, we have to start to, educate ourselves more in terms of what is the overall system we're in. Because whether somebody is here causing confusion or whatever the case is, it is for us now to, again, take this opportunity that we have to negotiate the best document possible to remedy some of these issues. Because...
because I'm still not sure in terms of the time that we're in, but I know we still have to touch on little things, and we've hammered that one.
Well, we haven't hammered it yet because there's
always
2
be
points.
more. There would always be more. So I figured that
there's just 2 points I would like to
make. Let's move to the next.
So
very shortly.
Yeah, let's look at this. But one of because we didn't touch on all of the independent body institutions, right? For example, there is the complaint commission. The commissioners recommended certain things in terms of the complaint commission. The complaint commissioner can write a report, and where they find certain things, it can be referred to the integrity commission, as
Yeah.
you mentioned
And
earlier.
that one is tied to the Constitution.
And that one, but I think what we overlook though is what is the point of having a complaints commission
If it
where
doesn't-
persons have legitimate complaints? They go and they file their complaint. A report is written, and the report is laid on the house of the table, and everybody smiles and say, "Good work." That doesn't solve the problem.
No.
So I think what we would want to say, at least from my end, is that there's something missing. Now we noted when there are issues that that comes back to the integrity issues, but those are specific issues at specific levels. But persons have specific problems as it relates to administration. And a lot of people complain about how they feel their matters are being dealt with. And they might even come and say, listen, that's just maladministration.
Yeah.
How do you fix that? Because now the members of the House of Assembly, in terms of their committees, do they now have a committee that takes this report,
And addresses
address the
issues.
report, and probably call in persons to give evidence,
Yeah.
to deal with the matter, and then come to a formal conclusion? And then at the end of the day, they might say, you know what? The problem is not so much the administrators around, but the problem is the law that we have. Let's fix it. What I'm saying is that it's nice to say we have that. And I might want to add this, right? When I was in the House of Assembly, in the Legislative Council, and the new constitution came in, and the recommendations for a commission of
The human rights.
the one I'm talking about, I'm mixing myself up now. Sorry about that. But you're talking about the Complaints Commission.
Okay.
There were members who were adamant, we don't need no
need it.
complaint commission. We, the people that bring the complaints to us, and we just handle them. There were persons who were there saying that. They were saying, we don't need a commission. You don't need no complaint commission. That's our job, they say, as the district rep, to handle the problem. But we knew that. But so when it went in, it took a long time before it was actually implemented.
Yeah.
But
Because there were
Dr.
persons who were against the idea. So now that we have it, what I'm saying is that how do we ensure that it's being
More effective.
more effective?
Well, Dr. Smith, one of the beauties about the Constitutional Review Commission report is that, and this goes to the point I was actually going to make earlier, is that it allows for a bespoke model to be made,
Yeah.
a tailored model to be made to suit our purposes. Now, one of the things that the report mentioned was that, we have 70 statutory bodies. And this goes back to this goes back to independent institutions, right? We have 70 statutory bodies. Why not, instead of creating a whole new human rights commission, combine it with the office of the complaints commissioner? For instance, let the complaints commissioner's office be fully funded. Let them have he or she have two or three extra commissioners with him or her to investigate human rights issues and maladministration issues, and let the complaints commissioner be able to also make certain rulings.
But
Let them do that, like they do in for example, in the United Kingdom. And I know this is a completely apples and oranges example.
Comparison.
The financial ombudsman is able to make rulings against private institutions like banks when customers complain about ill treatment or a breach of various financial laws or codes of conduct. The financial ombudsman is able to make certain rulings, and there's no reason why the complaints commissioner can't do so with respect to human rights, with respect to whether or not natural justice has been followed by various departments, and so on and so forth.
I think it's interesting you should
But I
say
think
that,
the
right?
point that he makes is very interesting, because you are operating in a society that is, a population that is not that large, with a number, as you rightfully say, a number of institutions. And I think the report also mentioned something of sharing a secretariat. But by virtue of mentioning that, it kind of goes to your point, because what we have to do now is develop a mechanism that can work within the environment that we are operating in. And the question that lends itself is, how do we do that? And I heard you give some examples that sound very good. Whether or not they're practical, I'm not quite sure. But I think that is the type of discussion that we need to be having. How do we amalgamate all of these?
Consolidate.
How do we consolidate all of these particular institutions in this small population, and how best do we finance them, and do we administratively fund them? So I think that is the crux of the discussion, and I think the report brought that out very clearly in terms of an example of using a secretariat amongst them that is actually done in the CARICOM states.
Before we get towards that wrap-up point, we've touched on several areas. The one area we've not touched on, the judiciary. There is an interesting recommendation that comes to the judiciary. We're going to have to gag Daniel on this one.
Order in the court.
We're going to have to gag him on this one, right? But in the judiciary, there is the issue of trial by judge only. Now, let me, as I said, I like the fact that I spend a lot of time in the land of the dead. In 1867, 65, between 1865 and 1867, there was a whole constitutional change in the Virgin Islands, which was rushed through, right? The president of the Virgin Islands at that time, so rumbled. They said, listen, this whole thing about a jury trial, it doesn't work because the population was too small. And they changed it. Big problems. And that's where I found a list of all the colored people in the Virgin Islands who signed the petition against it. This is what the British system is based on. You can't change it. So now we come back how many years later? And now we're saying, well, what about this whole issue of trial by judge only? How do we deal with that one? Do we see it like our forefathers in the 1800s who figured that it can't work? Or do we see it that it's something that is essential?
But I will leave it to Daniel because...
You ungag him?
No, because there are certain offenses that are indictable that require a judge.
There were
and then there are certain offenses that are
that you need a jury
by themselves.
Yeah.
So I don't...
you don't know the nitty-gritty.
And that's a very interesting question in terms of would it be any type of criminal matter, or would it be
I think at that time they were specific in terms of civil cases or criminal cases. They had divided them, because they figured that it was important that you need to have that independent mind make a decision. Okay. So where are we at with this one, Dan? We have to ungag you. You're the expert.
This is perhaps one of the parts of the report that I can't agree with. And I have to take some of the blame for there not being a countervailing view expressed within the report, because perhaps I could have done more to ensure that the Commission received submissions from more than just the DPP with respect to the jury trials, right? It's something that I overlooked. And so I apologize for not doing what I needed to do to ensure that the Commission got the widest spectrum of views with respect to that. I believe that trial by jury should remain a fundamental right that can be waived by the defendant or by the accused.
I don't want to interrupt you, but just for the sake of edification, what was the rationale behind the...
Okay, so firstly, there was a recommendation in the report whereby the prosecution and the defense can apply for juryless trials. I don't want to give the jury that... I don't want to give the prosecution that for such things. The rationale is, oh, it's a very small jurisdiction, people are related, and so on and so forth. It's very hard for the prosecution, apparently, to get a fair and impartial jury. Although I haven't heard other directors of public prosecution have similar complaints. I don't know, maybe perhaps some outreach could be made towards them while we study this a bit more.
Okay.
As I say again, the recommendations, unlike the COI recommendations, which were directives, these are not directives. These are things for us to look at to see whether or not it suits our needs or suits our purposes, right? For us, we have a judge who comes in from some other place in the Caribbean, maybe not always the Caribbean, maybe Canada, some other place in the Commonwealth. They do not share the experiences of people that live here because they are, in fact, in a gilded cage. They don't socialize really that much. They have to really keep to themselves. And you need the jury to be able to appreciate the nuances of life in the Virgin Islands and circumstances in the Virgin Islands rather than ruling from an ivory tower. And that is why a trial by your peers is so important. They may not be your peers in terms of they may not be your compatriots, but because we have a huge proportion of immigrants in the Virgin Islands. I think the proportion is 60-40 or 70-30 or something along that lines.
Let me
I have a question for him.
let me make this a little bit clearer in terms of where Daniels is going. As a lawyer, we wouldn't argue with him, right? Because as we agree that he knows more than we would, right?
Sounds
But
like
I'll
he
tell
does.
you this one. At one point, we had what they call justices of the peace in the Virgin Islands. The justices of the peace would stand, they would sit on cases, right? So you had magistrates, you had justices because we didn't always have the system as it is today.
now.
So the justices of the peace would sit in court and hear certain civil cases, for example. There is a story about a particular justice of the peace who heard a case of a specific individual. And this is back in the 40s, 30s or somewhere there, right? And he said that at the end of it, when all the information was presented, you know what the conclusion was? He found him guilty, but he told you don't do it again.
So he showed mercy same way.
Because there were no sanctions.
Yeah.
No sanctions at all. He found him guilty because he understood the situation, yes. But then he said, so what you're saying has its value, but then,
But that's, I think this is where we
And
go
guys,
back.
we have to start to
This is
wrap
where
up
we
in
go
a
back
bit.
to the reality of our circumstances. We have to evaluate, because I think based on what you're saying, the rationale behind it is the same issue of the closeness and not having a big jury pool,
exactly.
hence allowing a judge in certain instances. However they go about doing it is one thing, but I think this is the actual point that we're trying to make, that we adjust our constitution and institutions to the environment that
Where
we
we are.
operating
The
in.
reality
Which is
that.
where it's supposed to
The
be.
reality.
But my question is not probably for us to answer here, though. Is there evidence that it is because we have a small jury pool that we have a backlog of cases?
The backlog of cases has there's a lot of yet.
Okay.
Hurricane
So
Irma.
I just wanted
won't get
to
into that because
clarify,
we
just
can't
to make
fix
that
that
point.
part.
But
So
yeah,
we
COVID.
gotta
No,
start
but just
to wrap up in a bit.
But just to
and,
give you a brief overview, it's just two things.
No, we don't have time for a brief overview.
Yeah.
Okay.
Your brief
gag
overview
him
will take
again.
us so much
We gag
time.
him again.
We'll be back. We're gonna lobby for a second session. I think we presented our case today, but
But the answer is no.
no.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And that's one of the things too. Again, just from thinking about it when I read it, it's like, is this really the root cause of this problem, or is it that we just want to give ourselves more options? And I'm all for giving ourselves more options in the cases where it is suitable that you do that, because the nuances that you spoke about in terms of somebody external to the community coming in and basically deciding the fate of the rest of your life, that's a big deal. We can't take those things for
but
granted.
as
but
we-
Doug, we have about
Yes.
5 minutes, so
As
we
we
gotta
wrap
bring it
up,
to
I
a
would
close.
simply say that it sounds good in theory, but then how many of us are actually prepared
I am not. I will fight that.
to sit as a jury, on a jury? How many to be jurors?
I'm
in a
exempt.
case?
Yeah.
And I always say, well, I know I can't do it because any case you bring out and listen, I know that one from the time you're 5 years old. I teach you in primary school. I thought I can't, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
how do we, are we in a position? So the pool gets smaller
Yeah.
and smaller.
The pool ain't got a thing to do with it.
How is that so?
Because there's a backlog of criminal cases in the magistrate's court,
Okay.
in
and
the
that's
jury.
there's no jury in the magistrate's court, so there's a
Okay.
backlog there. The problem is that the DPP's office doesn't have enough prosecutors, right? They don't. There's no criminal procedure rules. Like you have the civil procedure rules, and so if you don't have these rules guiding how these processes are going to happen, then things can be done
So
in a
that sounds
haphazard
like
manner.
public service reform.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
we
But
should
it
have
goes to
let
the
him get
point
it.
that
But,
Shaina was
You're bringing on my Tatola accents from me.
It goes to the point of us having to address issues and not just make changes. Like the rationale behind that particular point, we would have to investigate it. But I think we need to be very careful because this is not a reflection of the commissioners. You know,
Yeah.
these are people that put
This is the
forward
public opinion.
the public
Opinion,
opinion.
yeah.
Yeah.
So these things need a bit more fleshing out, and I think the report did make mention to a lot of these recommendations. So you'll notice that it's either A or B.
Yeah.
Like for instance, in the case if we get a 6 minister, then we could eliminate the junior minister.
It's a census
Well,
of
I-
sorts.
Yeah.
It's like a census.
So let's do this, guys.
I must then enforce the point that we need to wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay.
And lady and gentlemen, I think that we have done. I must be honest and say when I was asked first, I said yes, and I mumbled, and I said no, them don't make the bubble, and I must come fix it because I saw this one as a big one. But the reality is that it touches on serious issues that we now have to think more about as
And make critical
as a people.
decisions.
And you remember I said that in the 1967, Mr. Dawson said when persons got upset about the whole system that was being put forward, the ministerial system, there were arguments. He said, listen, we must deal with them rationally. All it is, these are recommendations. So we educate ourselves and we make rational decisions. I think we have done our bit to highlight the issues. It's a very large document, but then we know that there is a way forward. I think we have done our part, and my co-host is saying, well, listen, we co-moderators saying, well, listen, we lobby for another round.
Yeah.
Because we know that we have
It's all
only
part of the
touched-
continuing education.
Yeah, we have
they
only
act.
touched on some of the issues.
Never good enough. You gotta go a second
We
one.
had to go a second
Gotta go a
round,
second
so they
round.
don't know whether or not we were genuine.
But I think we gave a lot of food for thought,
Yeah.
though, in terms of, again, persons who may not have even participated up to this point
Yeah.
in the constitutional review exercise that has been going on, that they start to understand this is how this conversation affects my daily life.
Yep.
If something were to happen to me and end up in court, do I want to have a jury or
not.
a judge?
Yeah.
How is the country making its decisions around who's responsible for the money, who's making decisions about it? These are the things that we have to continue to bring to the forefront of people's minds, because anything in here that speaks to having a referendum, you can't go to the polls to do a referendum if you don't
Without
have the
education.
knowledge.
Yeah.
So
Correct.
we
Yeah.
want to make sure, I guess the overall objective of this today was to make sure that we have a more informed community as it relates to awareness around good governance. Good governance isn't for the politicians, it's actually for the people. So this is what we I think, guys, you did a very excellent job bringing all the different perspectives and as far as where we are. So you have 5 seconds, Daniel, to give your key takeaway.
No, I just want to say thank you very much for having me on this program. I say thank you to the Constitutional Review Commission for having me on this program this afternoon, or today, I should say. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I would just like to thank the Constitutional Review Commission for inviting me. What I would like to say to individuals is that this is a very important document and that you should take the time to read points that will affect your life. So again, thank you, and thank you to the panelists, and it was a very interesting discussion, and I look forward to many more.
Yeah. Well, I would say thanks also. It was refreshing. You know, we could have had a good breakdown argument, you know, knockout and fight, but we were able to be very civilized about it. And I think what we're saying is this is what we need to do all over the BVI. Discuss it.
Yes.
Discuss it.
And that's again very key for, you know, whether it's around the kitchen table, even with the younger kids, because this is their constitution really. 10 years from now, they're going to be living this out. So again, thank you to all our viewers, wherever you have tuned in from. You can get a copy of the report on the CRC's website, yourconstitution.vg. And it's also, I think, available on the government's website. So make sure you do pull this up. The next process, or I should say the next step in this process, is that the House of Assembly is expected to debate this. So we still have time as a community to feedback even to our elected representatives, because then this still has to be negotiated once it's been agreed to in terms of what will be taken to the United Kingdom for us to have the final document. So again, thank you for tuning in. Thanks to the CRC again for having all of us here, and do enjoy the rest of your day.
All right.